The saloon doors swung open with such force that the hinges nearly gave way, momentarily silencing the raucous patrons of the Golden Nugget. Everyone turned to stare at the woman standing in the doorway, her wedding dress mudded at the hem, tears streaming down her face, and her auburn hair falling from what had been an elegant arrangement just hours before. This was how Eleanor Sinclair arrived in Quartz Hill, Arizona Territory, in the spring of 1882, abandoned, pregnant, and with nowhere else to go. Preston Zachary watched the scene unfold from his usual corner table. Unlike the other cowboys and miners who quickly resumed their card games and drinking after the initial shock, he couldn't take his eyes off the woman. Maybe it was the way she squared her shoulders despite her obvious distress, or perhaps it was the protective way her hand rested on her slightly swollen belly. "Miss, you might want to try the boarding house down the street," Mabel, the barmaid, said gently. "This ain't exactly a place for a lady in your condition." "I have no money," Eleanor replied, her voice surprisingly steady despite her appearance, "and nowhere to go. My fiancé," her voice cracked. "He left me at the altar when he found out about the baby. Said he wouldn't raise another man's child." A few snickers rose from the crowd. Preston felt his jaw tighten. "Well, ain't that a shame?" one of the miners called out. "How about you earn your keep? Pretty thing like you could make good money upstairs." Laughter rippled through the room, and Eleanor's face flushed with humiliation. Before he realized what he was doing, Preston was on his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. At 32, he was no longer the hot-headed young man he'd once been, but something about this scene had ignited a fire in him he thought long extinguished. "That's enough," he said, his voice cutting through the din. He crossed the room in long strides until he stood beside the woman in white. "Miss, I don't know your story beyond what you've just told, but I've got a place outside town. It's nothing fancy, but there's a spare room and honest work if you want it." Whispers erupted around them. Preston Zachary offering charity. Must be the end times. Or he's looking for a different kind of payment. Preston ignored them, keeping his eyes on the woman's face. Up close, he could see freckles scattered across her nose and the wariness in her emerald eyes. "Why would you help me?" she asked, a question that made perfect sense given her circumstances. Preston removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with premature silver at the temples. "Madam, I was raised to believe that when someone's in trouble you help them, no strings attached." He paused. "I'll be straight with you. I've got a ranch that needs tending and I could use help with the cooking and such. In return, you get a roof, meals, and safety for you and your child." Eleanor studied him, taking in his weathered face, the fine lines around his blue eyes, and the calloused hand that still held his hat. Something in his steady gaze gave her pause. "I don't even know your name," she said. "Preston Zachary. Most folks call me Prees." He offered a small smile. "And you are Eleanor Sinclair." She hesitated. "Everyone calls me Ellie." Preston nodded. "Well, Miss Sinclair, what do you say? It's getting dark and Quartz Hill isn't kind to those without shelter." Eleanor glanced around the saloon at the leering faces and judgmental stares. Whatever this cowboy might be, he seemed better than the alternatives. "I accept your offer, Mr. Zachary," she said finally, "but I want to be clear, I won't be offering other services in exchange for your help." Preston's face colored slightly, but he nodded firmly. "I wouldn't ask that of you. You have my word." He offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. As they walked out of the saloon, Eleanor heard someone call out, "Taking in another stray, Zachary. This one's got extra baggage." Preston paused at the batwing doors. "I'll be father to her child if need be," he called back, his voice steady and clear. "Which is more than can be said for some men." His eyes swept the room, challenging anyone to contradict him. No one did. Outside, Preston helped Eleanor into his wagon. As they rode out of town, the setting sun cast long shadows across the desert landscape, and Eleanor wondered if she had made a terrible mistake or found an unexpected salvation. The journey to Preston's ranch took nearly an hour. They traveled mostly in silence, the rhythmic creaking of the wagon wheels filling the void between them. Eleanor took the opportunity to study her unlikely savior more carefully. Preston Zachary was tall and lean, with the kind of strength that came from years of hard work rather than vanity. His face was tanned and weathered from years under the Arizona sun, but there was a gentleness in his eyes that contradicted his otherwise rough appearance. He handled the horses with practiced ease, his large hands gentle on the reins. "How far along are you?" he asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Eleanor's hand instinctively went to her stomach. "About 4 months," Preston nodded. "My sister had 3 children before she passed. I remember how sick she was with the first one." "I'm sorry about your sister," Eleanor said softly. "The morning sickness has mostly passed now, thankfully." "That's good." He glanced at her briefly. "I should warn you the place isn't much. Been meaning to fix it up, but—" He trailed off with a shrug. Mr. Zachary, after spending last night sleeping in the church vestibule and today being left at the altar, anything with a roof will seem like a palace. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Fair enough. As they crested a small hill, Preston's ranch came into view. It was modest but neat, a main house built of sturdy logs with a small porch, a barn, and a few outbuildings. A corral held several horses, and in the distance, Eleanor could make out cattle grazing on the scrubland. "It's lovely," she said sincerely. Preston gave her a skeptical look. "You don't have to say that." "No, I mean it. It's peaceful." And it was. After the chaos of the last few days, the quiet ranch with its backdrop of mountains and endless sky seemed like a haven. Preston helped her down from the wagon, his hands strong and steady at her waist. For a brief moment, they stood close enough that Eleanor could smell the leather and pine scent of him. She stepped back quickly, suddenly aware of how inappropriate this all was. A pregnant woman, alone with a stranger, miles from town. As if reading her thoughts, Preston moved away, giving her space. "Let me show you to your room. You must be tired." The inside of the house was simple but surprisingly tidy. A main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. A narrow hallway led to what Eleanor presumed were bedrooms. "This will be your room," Preston said, opening a door. "It's not much, but the bed's clean." The room was small but comfortable, with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a small window that looked out over the mountains. "It's perfect," Eleanor said, and meant it. Preston nodded. "Bathroom's out back. I'll heat some water if you want to wash up, and I'll fix us something to eat." "You cook?" Eleanor couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Been on my own a long time. Man's got to eat." When he left, Eleanor sat heavily on the bed, the events of the day finally catching up with her. She had awakened that morning expecting to become Mrs. Thomas Wellington by noon. Instead, when she had nervously confessed her pregnancy to Thomas before the ceremony, hoping for understanding, she had received only disgust and accusations. "Whose is it?" he had demanded. When she explained about the attack months ago while traveling to visit her aunt, he hadn't believed her. No one had. In their eyes, she was ruined, damaged goods, a fallen woman. Eleanor pressed her hands to her eyes, willing herself not to cry again. She had done enough of that. Now she needed to think of the future, hers and her child's. A soft knock at the door roused her from her thoughts. "Miss Sinclair, I've got some hot water and found a clean dress that might fit you. It was my sister's." Eleanor opened the door to find Preston holding a large basin of steaming water and a simple blue dress draped over his arm. "Thank you," she said, taking the items. "And please call me Ellie." "Miss Sinclair seems too formal given the circumstances," he nodded. "Ellie then, and I'm Pries." He hesitated. "Supper will be ready in about half an hour, nothing fancy, just beans and biscuits." "That sounds wonderful." After he left, Eleanor washed away the dust and tears of the day, grateful for the simple comfort of warm water and clean clothes. The dress was slightly large but fit well enough over her growing belly. She combed her hair and pinned it back simply, then took a deep breath and went to join her host. Preston was at the stove, his back to her as he stirred something in a cast iron pot. He had changed into a clean shirt, and his hair was damp as if he too had washed up. "Can I help?" Eleanor asked. He turned and for a moment just looked at her. "You clean up nice," he said finally, then seemed embarrassed by the comment. "I mean, you look rested." "Thank you." Eleanor smiled, finding his awkwardness endearing. "For everything." Preston nodded, turning back to the stove. "Hope you like beans." The meal was simple but satisfying. As they ate, Preston explained the workings of the ranch. He had about 50 head of cattle, a small orchard, and a vegetable garden that could use a woman's touch, as he put it. "I've never been much for gardening," Eleanor admitted. "But I'm willing to learn." "What are you good at then?" Preston asked, not unkindly. Eleanor considered. "I can cook so, and I'm good with numbers. I kept the books for my father's store before he passed." Preston looked interested. "Could use help with the accounts." "Never been much good with figures myself." As the evening wore on, they fell into easy conversation. Preston told her about coming to Arizona 15 years earlier, building the ranch from nothing. Eleanor shared bits of her own story growing up in Philadelphia, losing her parents to influenza, coming west to start anew. She didn't tell him about the attack, about the man who had grabbed her from the stagecoach during a stop, dragged her into the woods, and left her with more than just physical scars. She wasn't ready to share that yet, not with someone she had just met, no matter how kind he seemed. As Eleanor prepared for bed that night, she found herself feeling something she hadn't expected: hope. Perhaps here, miles from judgment and whispers, she could build a new life for herself and her child. What she didn't know was that Preston Zachary had demons of his own, secrets that had kept him isolated on this ranch for years, and that their chance meeting would change both their lives in ways neither could imagine. The rooster's crow woke Eleanor at dawn. For a moment, she was disoriented, the unfamiliar room and bed confusing her still drowsy mind. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back: the wedding that never happened, the humiliation at the saloon, and Preston Zachary's unexpected offer of help. She placed a hand on her rounded belly, feeling the slight flutter of movement within. "It's just you and me now, little one," she whispered. "We're going to be all right." After dressing in the borrowed blue dress, Eleanor made her way to the kitchen. To her surprise, Preston was already gone, though he had left coffee brewing on the stove and a note on the table. "Gone to check the north pasture. Back by noon. Make yourself at home. PZ." Eleanor poured herself a cup of coffee, then set about exploring her new surroundings in the daylight. The ranch was larger than it had appeared in the twilight of the previous evening. Beyond the main house and barn, there was a chicken coop, a smokehouse, and a small workshop. The vegetable garden Preston had mentioned was indeed in need of attention, its beds overrun with weeds, though she could see tomatoes, beans, and squash struggling to thrive. She rolled up her sleeves and set to work. The physical labor felt good after days of emotional turmoil. By mid-morning, she had cleared 2 beds and collected nearly a dozen eggs from the coop. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear the approaching rider until a shadow fell across the garden. "You don't waste time, do you?" Eleanor looked up, shielding her eyes against the sun. Preston sat atop his horse, his expression a mixture of surprise and approval. "I wanted to earn my keep," she replied, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. Preston dismounted in one fluid motion. "You didn't have to start so soon. You must be tired after everything." "Keeping busy helps me not to think too much." Eleanor stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. "Besides, I found eggs. I thought I might make us a proper breakfast." A small smile crossed Preston's face. "Been a while since I had a proper breakfast." As they walked toward the house, Preston carrying a basket of vegetables Eleanor had salvaged from the garden, she noticed him watching her with curiosity. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "Nothing," he said quickly. "Just, you're not what I expected." "And what did you expect, Mr. Zachary?" "Please," he reminded her. "And I don't know. Most women would still be crying after what you went through yesterday." "I did my crying," Eleanor said simply. "Now I need to figure out what comes next." In the kitchen, Eleanor set about making a breakfast of eggs and biscuits while Preston washed up outside. She found comfort in the familiar routine of cooking, in having something useful to do with her hands. When Preston returned, his hair damp and his face freshly shaved, they sat down to eat. Eleanor noticed that he bowed his head briefly before picking up his fork, a small gesture of grace that surprised her. "This is real good," he said after his first bite. "Best meal I've had in this house in years." "Thank you." Eleanor smiled, pleased by the compliment. "I've been thinking about what you said last night about helping with the accounts. I'd be happy to look at them whenever you're ready." Preston nodded. "Got them in a box somewhere. Been meaning to sort them out before tax time." He hesitated. "There's something else we should discuss." Eleanor tensed, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth. "Yes, your condition," Preston said carefully. "People in town are going to talk. They already are, I'd wager." "People always talk," Eleanor said, trying to sound braver than she felt. "I'm used to it. Still, it might be easier if—" Preston cleared his throat. "If they thought you were a widow or even my wife." Eleanor's eyes widened. "Your wife." "Just for appearances," Preston added quickly. "Quartz Hill's a small town. Folks are traditional. A single woman living with a man, especially in your condition, it won't sit well." "And what exactly are you suggesting?" Eleanor asked, her voice cooler than she intended. Preston ran a hand through his hair, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm not explaining this well. I meant we could tell people we're married. You could wear a ring, use my name. It would make things simpler when you go into town or when the baby comes." Eleanor considered his words. He wasn't wrong. A pretend marriage would offer protection from gossip and judgment. And yet, why would you do that? You barely know me. Preston looked at her steadily. "Because it's the decent thing to do, and because I meant what I said in the saloon. I don't mind being a father to your child, at least in the eyes of the town." "And what would you get out of this arrangement?" Eleanor asked, still suspicious. "Company," Preston said simply. "Been alone too long, it's no good for a man." He paused. "And I need help with the ranch, it's too much for one person." Eleanor considered his offer. It was practical if unorthodox. And if she was honest with herself, the idea of facing the world as a respectable married woman rather than a fallen one held appeal. "People will wonder why they never heard of me before," she pointed out. Preston shrugged. "We'll say we married in Tucson a few months back. I don't go to town often enough for anyone to question it too deeply. And when the baby comes, it will be obvious from the timing that—" Eleanor trailed off, a flush rising to her cheeks. "We'll say it came early," Preston said matter-of-factly, "or that we were together before the wedding. People will talk either way, but they'll move on to something else eventually." Eleanor took a sip of her coffee, buying time to think. This strange cowboy was offering her a chance at respectability, a shield against the cruelty she knew awaited her in town. It wasn't a real marriage he was proposing, but a practical partnership. "All right," she said finally. "But I want to be clear about the terms. This is an arrangement of convenience only. I'll work hard and earn my keep, but there won't be." She faltered, unsure how to delicately phrase her concerns. "I understand," Preston said, saving her from having to finish. "You'll have your privacy. I gave you my word yesterday, and I meant it." Relief flooded through Eleanor. "Then I accept your offer, Mr. Zachary. If we're going to be pretending to be married, you'd better start calling me Prees," he said with the hint of a smile. "Prees," Eleanor repeated, testing the name on her tongue. "And I'm Ellie." "Ellie Zachary," Preston said thoughtfully, "has a nice ring to it." And strangely, Eleanor thought it did. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm. Eleanor took charge of the household, cooking, cleaning, and slowly bringing order to the chaotic filing system Preston called his accounts. Preston worked from dawn until dusk with the cattle and horses, making repairs around the ranch, and teaching Eleanor about life in the Arizona Territory. They developed an easy companionship, sharing meals and the occasional evening game of checkers. Preston was quieter than any man Eleanor had known, but when he did speak, his words were thoughtful and often laced with dry humor that made her laugh. He was unfailingly respectful of her privacy and never entered her room, though sometimes Eleanor would catch him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. In those moments, she would feel a strange flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with the baby. As her 5th month of pregnancy progressed, Eleanor's belly grew more pronounced and the baby's movements became stronger. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, the child gave a particularly vigorous kick. "Oh!" Eleanor exclaimed, her hand flying to her stomach. Preston looked alarmed. "What is it? Are you all right?" "Yes, it's just the baby is kicking. Would you like to feel?" The words were out before Eleanor could consider their impropriety. In Philadelphia, such an invitation would have been scandalous, but out here, the normal rules seemed far away. Preston hesitated, then nodded. Eleanor took his large, calloused hand and placed it on the swell of her belly. For a moment, nothing happened, and then I felt it. Preston's face lit up with wonder. "That's really something." His hand lingered perhaps a moment longer than necessary before he drew it back, a flush creeping up his neck. "Strong little thing." "Yes," Eleanor agreed, oddly touched by his reaction. "I think it's going to be a handful." "You'll be a good mother," Preston said with conviction. "How can you be so sure? I have no idea what I'm doing." Preston's gaze turned distant. "Nobody does at first, but I've watched you these past weeks. You're kind, patient, and strong. Those are the important things." His words warmed her, but they also made her curious about the man who had so unexpectedly become her protector. "Did you ever want children of your own?" she asked carefully. Preston was quiet for so long that Eleanor thought he might not answer. "Once," he said finally. "A long time ago." "What happened?" Preston stood up, his expression closing off. "It's getting late. I should check on the horses before turning in." Eleanor watched him walk away, aware that she had touched on something painful. Despite their daily proximity, Preston remained something of a mystery. She knew he had come to Arizona as a young man, that he had lost his sister and parents, but little else of his personal history. He never spoke of friends or sweethearts, and though he was well regarded in town from what little she had gathered, he seemed to keep everyone at a distance. It made her wonder what had happened to make such a good man choose solitude. The opportunity to learn more came unexpectedly the following week. Preston needed to ride to a neighboring ranch to help with a cattle drive, which would keep him away for several days. Before leaving, he had taken Eleanor into town to introduce her as his wife and to purchase supplies. The trip had been an uncomfortable mixture of curiosity and thinly veiled judgment. Preston had been protective, keeping her close as he introduced her to key townspeople, the general store owner, the doctor, and the sheriff. "Didn't know you had it in you to court a woman, let alone marry one, Zachary," Sheriff Miller had said with a knowing look at Eleanor's condition. "Some things are worth waiting for," Preston had replied evenly, his hand steady at the small of Eleanor's back. Now, with Preston away, Eleanor took the opportunity to explore the house more thoroughly. Not out of nosiness, she told herself, but to better understand the man who had so fundamentally altered her circumstances. In his bedroom, which she had never entered before, she found few personal items: a Bible on the nightstand, a photograph of a woman who must have been his sister, and a small wooden box on the dresser. Curiosity got the better of her, and she opened it. Inside was a tarnished silver locket, a few letters tied with string, and a folded newspaper clipping. Eleanor hesitated, then carefully unfolded the yellowed paper. It was an article from 1874, headlined "Tragedy at Miller's Creek." The story described a bank robbery gone wrong, resulting in the deaths of 2 townspeople, including a young woman named Sarah Jensen. The article mentioned that she had been engaged to a local rancher, Preston Zachary, who had been seriously wounded trying to protect her. Eleanor's hand trembled as she carefully refolded the article and returned it to the box. So this was Preston's secret, the love he had lost, the reason for his solitude. She thought of his scars, visible when he rolled up his sleeves to work, and wondered how many were physical and how many ran deeper. She closed the box and left the room, feeling guilty for invading his privacy, but also understanding him better. The knowledge made her heart ache for him and increased her gratitude for his kindness to her, a stranger with troubles of her own. When Preston returned 3 days later, dusty and tired from the cattle drive, Eleanor had prepared a special dinner and cleaned the house from top to bottom. It was the least she could do for the man who had given her shelter when she needed it most. "This is quite a welcome," Preston said, looking surprised at the effort she had made. "I wanted to thank you," Eleanor said simply, "for everything." Something in her voice must have given her away because Preston studied her face carefully. "Did something happen while I was gone?" Eleanor hesitated. "I found the newspaper article," she admitted. "About Sarah. I'm sorry I shouldn't have been in your things." Preston's expression darkened momentarily, then he sighed. "I suppose you were bound to find out sooner or later. Small towns have long memories." "No one in town mentioned it," Eleanor assured him. "I was just curious about you." Preston nodded, his face unreadable. "Sarah and I were to be married the week after the robbery. I couldn't save her." "I'm so sorry," Eleanor said softly, reaching out to touch his arm. "It wasn't your fault, wasn't it?" Preston's voice was bitter. "I was right there. I should have been faster, smarter." "You were wounded trying to protect her," Eleanor pointed out. "The article said you nearly died yourself." Preston's hand unconsciously went to his side, where Eleanor guessed a scar must be. "Sometimes I wish I had." The raw pain in his voice made Eleanor's throat tighten. "Don't say that. What happened was tragic, but you've done good since then. You've built this ranch, you've helped people including me." Preston looked at her then, really looked at her, and for a moment Eleanor thought she saw something shift in his eyes. Then he turned away. "Let's eat before it gets cold," he said, clearly wanting to change the subject. "You went to a lot of trouble." Eleanor let the matter drop, but that night as she lay in bed, she thought about Preston Zachary and the burden he had carried alone for 8 years. She thought about her own burdens, the attack that had left her pregnant, the rejection by her fiancé, the uncertain future. Perhaps that was why Preston had helped her. He understood what it was to have life altered in an instant, to face judgment and loss. In their separate pain, they had found a common ground of sorts. What she hadn't expected was how much she had come to care for him in such a short time. It wasn't just gratitude she felt, but genuine affection for this quiet, honorable man who had opened his home to her and her unborn child. As her baby kicked inside her, Eleanor wondered what the future might hold for them all. She had come to Quartz Hill seeking a fresh start, never imagining that it would come in the form of a pretend marriage to a scarred cowboy with secrets of his own. Yet somehow, this strange arrangement felt more real, more honest than her engagement to Thomas had ever been. And that realization was as frightening as it was comforting. The summer heat intensified as July gave way to August. Eleanor's pregnancy progressed into the 6th month, her belly now prominently rounded. The morning sickness had long passed, but the Arizona heat brought new discomforts. Despite this, she continued to work alongside Preston, refusing to be idle. One particularly hot afternoon, as Eleanor was hanging laundry, she noticed a dust cloud approaching the ranch. Preston, who had been mending a fence nearby, saw it too and hurried over to her side. "We've got company," he said, frowning. "Not expecting anyone. Should I go inside?" Eleanor asked, aware that their pretend marriage might not withstand close scrutiny. Preston shook his head. "No need to hide. Just follow my lead." The approaching riders turned out to be Sheriff Miller and another man Eleanor didn't recognize. The stranger was well dressed despite the dust of travel, with a pinstriped suit and a bowler hat that seemed out of place in the rugged landscape. "Afternoon, Zachary," the sheriff called as they rode into the yard. "Hope we're not interrupting." "Sheriff," Preston nodded, his posture tense. "What brings you out this way?" Sheriff Miller dismounted, followed by the stranger. "This is Mr. Howard from Wells Fargo. He's tracking down some information about a stagecoach robbery back in March near Santa Fe." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. March. Santa Fe. The attack had happened during a stagecoach journey from Santa Fe to Albuquerque. "What's that got to do with us?" Preston asked, moving slightly to stand between Eleanor and the visitors. Mr. Howard stepped forward, mopping his brow with a handkerchief. "We believe one of the passengers might have information about the bandits. A Miss Eleanor Sinclair. We've been tracking her movements and learned she might be in this area." Eleanor's heart pounded so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. Her hand instinctively went to her belly in a protective gesture. Preston's voice was steady when he spoke. "My wife's maiden name was Sinclair, Eleanor Sinclair. We've been married 4 months now." Mr. Howard looked at Eleanor with newfound interest. "Is that so, Mrs. Zachary? Were you traveling by stagecoach from Santa Fe to Albuquerque in March of this year?" Eleanor felt Preston's eyes on her, questioning. She nodded slowly. "Yes, I was." "Then you were present during the robbery on March 12th, Howard pressed. "When the coach was stopped by 3 masked men." "Yes," Eleanor whispered, memories flooding back: the sudden stop, the shouts, the rough hands dragging her away from the other passengers while they were being robbed, taking her into the woods. "Mrs. Zachary was injured during that incident," Preston said firmly, moving closer to Eleanor. "It's not something she likes to discuss." Howard nodded sympathetically. "I understand, but any information she could provide might help us catch these men. They've robbed 3 more coaches since then, and in the last one they killed a passenger who resisted." "I didn't see their faces," Eleanor said, finding her voice. "They wore bandanas over their faces, but one of them had a distinctive scar on his hand like a burn." And another spoke with a slight Mexican accent. Howard made notes in a small book. "Anything else you can recall? Height, build, anything distinctive about their clothing?" Eleanor closed her eyes, trying to remember details beyond the terror. The one with the scarred hand was tall, over 6 feet. He wore a duster with a tear in the left sleeve. The leader had a silver watch chain that caught the sunlight. "This is very helpful, Mrs. Zachary," Howard said, continuing to write. "We believe these men are headed this way, possibly planning more robberies along the Arizona stage routes." "Is my wife in any danger?" Preston asked, his concern evident. Sheriff Miller shook his head. "No reason to think so. They wouldn't recognize her, and they likely don't know she provided information." "Nevertheless," Preston said firmly, "I'd appreciate it if you'd keep us informed of any developments." After the men had gone, Preston turned to Eleanor, his expression a mixture of concern and confusion. "You want to tell me what that was really about?" he asked quietly. "Because I'm guessing there's more to this story than a simple robbery." Eleanor's hands trembled as she twisted her borrowed wedding ring. "Can we sit down somewhere, please?" They moved to the shade of the porch, where Eleanor sank gratefully into a chair. For a moment, she couldn't speak, the memories she had tried so hard to suppress washing over her in vivid detail. "The stagecoach was robbed, just like they said," she began, her voice barely audible. "But while the others were being held at gunpoint, one of the men, the tall one with the scarred hand, dragged me away from the group." She paused, struggling to continue. Preston's face darkened with understanding. "Ellie, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," she interrupted. "You should know the truth. You've done so much for me, and I've been hiding this." She took a deep breath. "He took me into the woods and he forced himself on me, that's how." Her hand went to her belly, Preston's jaw clenched, a muscle twitching in his cheek. "The baby's father is the man who attacked you." It wasn't a question, but Eleanor nodded anyway. "When I told Thomas, my fiancé, he said he couldn't raise another man's child, especially one conceived that way. He called off the wedding the morning of the ceremony, just hours before you found me." Preston was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. When he finally spoke, his voice was controlled, but Eleanor could hear the anger beneath it. "If I ever meet this Thomas, I might have to teach him what it means to be a man." Despite everything, Eleanor felt a small smile tug at her lips. "That's very gallant of you." "It's not gallantry," Preston said seriously. "It's basic human decency." He turned to look at her directly. "Ellie, what happened to you was a terrible crime, but it doesn't change who you are. And that child," he nodded toward her belly, "is innocent. It deserves love and protection just like any other." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes at his words. "That's why I couldn't. I know some women would have tried to end it, but I just couldn't." "You're braver than most men I know," Preston said quietly. Eleanor shook her head. "I don't feel brave. Most days I'm terrified. What kind of life can I give this child? How will I explain where it came from when it's old enough to ask?" Preston considered this for a moment. "You'll tell the truth, in a way that protects the child but doesn't lie. You'll say that sometimes good things can come from bad situations, that the child is loved for itself, not for how it came to be." His words touched Eleanor deeply. For the first time since the attack, she felt truly understood. "Thank you," she said softly, "for listening, for not judging." Preston reached out and, after a moment's hesitation, covered her hand with his. "Nobody has the right to judge you, Ellie, least of all me." In that moment, with the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the ranch and Preston's hand warm on hers, Eleanor felt something shift between them. This man who had started as her reluctant rescuer had become something more: a friend, a confidant, and perhaps, someday, something else entirely. But that was a thought for another day. For now, it was enough to know that she wasn't alone anymore. The days grew shorter as summer turned to fall. Eleanor's pregnancy advanced into the 7th month. then the 8th. Her body grew heavy with the child, but her spirit lightened as she and Preston fell into an easy rhythm of work and companionship. Their pretend marriage had become comfortable, almost real in many ways. They shared meals, stories, and occasionally, when the night air carried a chill, they would sit together by the fire, Preston reading aloud from one of his few books while Eleanor sewed baby clothes from fabric purchased in town. The people of Quartz Hill had largely accepted their story, though Eleanor occasionally caught curious glances when they ventured into town together. Preston was protective, always at her side, his hand steady at her elbow or the small of her back. Sometimes, Eleanor found herself forgetting that it was all for show. One crisp October morning, as they were having breakfast, Preston cleared his throat in the way he did when he had something important to say. "Been thinking," he began, not quite meeting her eyes. "The baby will be here soon." Eleanor nodded, unconsciously rubbing her rounded belly. "Another month, according to Dr. Wilson. We should discuss what happens after." Eleanor's heart sank. Of course, their arrangement had never been meant to be permanent. Once the baby was born, she would need to make her own way. The thought was more painful than she had expected. "I understand," she said carefully. "I've been saving from the egg money. I should have enough to get us to California by spring." Preston looked up, startled. "California? Is that what you want?" Eleanor hesitated. The truth was, she didn't want to leave Quartz Hill, or rather, she didn't want to leave Preston. Over these months, her feelings for him had deepened into something she had been afraid to name, even to herself. "I assumed you'd want your life back," she said quietly. "Your privacy, your home." Preston set down his coffee cup with more force than necessary. "Ellie, this is your home too, yours and the baby's, unless," he faltered, "unless you want to leave." "No," Eleanor admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to leave." Relief washed over Preston's face. "Good. Because I've been thinking about making this arrangement more permanent." Eleanor's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" Preston stood up abruptly and moved to the window, his back to her. "I'm not good with words, Ellie. Never have been. But these past months, having you here, it's been the happiest I've been in years." Eleanor hardly dared to breathe, afraid to break the moment. "I've been happy too, please." He turned to face her, his expression earnest. "What I'm trying to say is, I'd like to marry you for real this time. If you'll have me." Of all the things Eleanor had expected him to say, this wasn't one of them. "You want to marry me? Why?" "Because I care for you," Preston said simply. "More than I thought I could care for anyone again after Sarah. And because that child deserves a father who'll be there from the start." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "Please, I can't ask you to do that. To take on another man's child. You're not asking. I'm offering." Preston moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "Ellie, I know this isn't how either of us planned our lives to go. And I know I'm not the man you dreamed of when you were a girl. But I promise you this: I'll work every day to be worthy of you and that child. I'll protect you both with my life if need be." Eleanor searched his face, looking for any sign of doubt or regret. She found none, only earnest blue eyes gazing steadily back at her. "What about love?" she asked softly. "Shouldn't marriage be about love?" Preston's expression softened. "I think we both know there are different kinds of love. Some burn hot and fast, like a prairie fire. Others build slow and steady, like the sunrise." He paused. "I can't promise you poetry and grand gestures, Ellie, but I can promise loyalty, respect, and a partnership that grows stronger with time." His words resonated deeply with Eleanor. She had once thought herself in love with Thomas, but what had that been based on? A few dances, some pretty words, promises that had proven empty when tested. What Preston offered was something more substantial: a love built on shared experiences, mutual respect, and genuine caring. "Yes," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "Yes, I'll marry you, Preston Zachary." The smile that broke across Preston's face was like the sun emerging from clouds. Without thinking, Eleanor leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was brief, almost chaste, but it sealed their agreement more firmly than any words could have. When they parted, Preston's eyes were bright. "Well," he said, sounding slightly breathless, "I suppose we should make it official before the little one arrives." And so, on a clear November morning, with the distant mountains touched by the first snows of winter, Eleanor Sinclair and Preston Zachary were married for real in the small church in Quartz Hill. The ceremony was simple, attended only by Sheriff Miller and his wife, Dr. Wilson, and his family, and a few townspeople who had come to respect the quiet rancher and his pregnant bride. Eleanor wore a dress of deep blue that Mrs. Wilson had helped her alter to accommodate her advanced pregnancy. Preston wore his best shirt and a new waistcoat purchased for the occasion. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Preston's kiss was gentle but sure, a promise of the life they would build together. That night, as they sat on the porch of what was now truly their home, watching the stars emerge in the vast Arizona sky, Eleanor felt a peace she hadn't known in a very long time. "No regrets?" Preston asked, his arm around her shoulders. Eleanor leaned against him, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "None. You? Only that I didn't find you sooner," he said, and kissed the top of her head. As if in response, the baby kicked vigorously, making them both laugh. "I think someone approves," Eleanor said, placing Preston's hand on her belly to feel the movement. "Strong opinions already," Preston observed with a smile. "Definitely takes after its mother." Eleanor elbowed him gently. "Very funny." As they sat in comfortable silence, Eleanor thought about the strange journey that had brought her here. 6 months ago, she had been abandoned at the altar, pregnant and alone, with no hope for the future. Now, she was married to a good man who had chosen to be a father to her child, living on a ranch that was becoming more prosperous under their joint care. Life had a strange way of working out sometimes. The baby arrived 2 weeks later, in the middle of a December snowstorm that had cut them off from town. Preston had ridden for Dr. Wilson at the first signs of Eleanor's labor, but the rapidly deteriorating weather had forced him to turn back before reaching Quartz Hill. "I'm sorry, Ellie," he said, stamping snow from his boots as he re-entered the cabin. "The pass is blocked. We're on our own." Eleanor, already in the grip of strong contractions, nodded grimly. "Then we'll manage. Women have been having babies without doctors for centuries." Her bravado lasted until the pain intensified, coming in waves that left her gasping. Preston, to his credit, remained calm, boiling water, preparing clean linens, and following the instructions in a medical book he'd purchased weeks earlier in anticipation of just such an emergency. "You're doing fine," he assured her, wiping her brow with a cool cloth. "Just breathe through it, like Dr. Wilson showed you." Hours passed, with Eleanor alternately walking the small bedroom and lying down to rest between contractions. As night fell, the storm intensified, the wind howling around the eaves of the house like a living thing. "I can't do this," Eleanor gasped after a particularly fierce contraction. "It's too much." Preston took her hand firmly in his. "Yes, you can. You're the strongest woman I know, Ellie Zachary. And I'm right here with you." His unwavering faith in her gave Eleanor courage. When the time came to push, she drew on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed, Preston supporting her back and murmuring encouragement. And then, just as the storm began to abate in the early hours of the morning, a new cry joined the fading wind, the lusty wail of a healthy baby entering the world. "It's a boy," Preston announced, his voice thick with emotion as he carefully cleaned the squalling infant. A perfect little boy. Tears streamed down Eleanor's face as Preston placed the swaddled newborn in her arms. She looked down at the tiny face, with its shock of dark hair and rosebud mouth, and felt a surge of love so powerful it took her breath away. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "I'm your mama." The baby's cries subsided as he nestled against her, instinctively seeking her warmth. Eleanor looked up at Preston, who was watching them with an expression of wonder. "Would you like to hold your son?" she asked softly. Preston hesitated, looking suddenly unsure. "I don't want to drop him." "You won't," Eleanor assured him. "Here, sit beside me." Carefully, she transferred the baby into Preston's arms. The contrast was striking, the tiny infant cradled by the weathered cowboy's large hands. But Preston held him with infinite gentleness, his blue eyes wide with awe. "He's so small," Preston marveled. "Look at his fingers, they're perfect." As if in response to his voice, the baby opened his eyes, revealing irises of deep blue that would likely darken with time. "What should we name him?" Eleanor asked. Preston considered for a moment. "What about Samuel?" "After my father, Samuel Zachary." "Samuel," Eleanor repeated, tasting the name. "I like it. Samuel Preston Zachary." Preston looked up in surprise. "You want to give him my name, of course," Eleanor said simply. "You're his father in every way that matters." Something shifted in Preston's expression, then a softening, a vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to show. "Thank you," he said hoarsely. As dawn broke over the snow-covered ranch, the small family dozed together, the new parents too captivated by their son to consider sleep. When the baby began to fuss, Eleanor nursed him, amazed at how natural it felt, how right. "He's going to be tall like you," she observed, noting Samuel's long limbs. Preston smiled. "But he has your nose, I think, and maybe your stubbornness." Eleanor laughed softly. Poor child, doomed from the start. The storm had passed by midday, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white. Preston ventured out to tend to the animals and check the road, returning with the news that it would likely be passable by the following day. "Should I try to get to town?" "Fetch the doctor to check on you and Samuel." Eleanor shook her head. "We're fine, Pries, both of us. But perhaps you could send word that we have a new addition to the family." Preston nodded, his face breaking into a proud smile. "That I can do. I'll ride to the Johnson place. They've got that new telephone connection. They can spread the word." When he had gone, Eleanor held her son close, marveling at the miracle of his existence. Despite the violent circumstances of his conception, Samuel was perfect, innocent, a new beginning. And Preston had been right. The boy deserved to be loved for himself, not judged by his origins. In the days that followed, visitors braved the winter roads to come see the newest resident of Quartz Hill. Dr. Wilson pronounced both mother and child healthy, though he scolded Preston for not having a backup plan when the storm hit. "Next time, have a neighbor on standby," the doctor advised. "Babies don't wait for convenient weather. Next time." Preston had repeated, looking so alarmed that both Eleanor and the doctor had laughed. As winter deepened, the small family settled into a new routine. Preston proved to be a devoted father, taking his turn walking with Samuel when he was fussy at night, changing diapers with the same focus he gave to branding cattle, and spending hours simply watching the baby sleep. Eleanor observed the transformation with a full heart. The reserved, sometimes taciturn man she had married was revealing new facets of himself: daily gentleness, patience, and a capacity for joy she hadn't fully appreciated before. One evening, as they sat by the fire after putting Samuel down for the night, Eleanor broached a subject that had been on her mind. "Pries, do you think you could teach me to ride? and maybe how to use a firearm. Preston looked up from the bridle he was mending, surprised. Any particular reason? Eleanor nodded. After what Mr. Howard said about those stagecoach bandits possibly being in the area, I want to be able to protect Samuel if I need to, especially when you're away from the house. Preston considered her request. Makes sense. We'll start with riding once the doctor says you're fully recovered. As for shooting, he smiled slightly. I've seen how determined you can be. I reckon you'll be a natural. Thank you, Eleanor said, relieved he had taken her request seriously. Preston set aside his work. Ellie, there's something I've been meaning to tell you, something I should have said before now. Eleanor tensed, years of experience having taught her that such conversations rarely brought good news. What is it? Preston moved to sit beside her on the small sofa. It's about Sarah. About what happened after she died. Eleanor waited, giving him space to find the words. After the robbery, after I recovered from my injuries, I tracked down the men who did it. Preston's voice was flat, emotionless. There were 3 of them. I found them in a saloon near the border. Eleanor's breath caught. What happened? I killed 2 of them. Preston's eyes were fixed on the fire, seeing something else entirely. The 3rd escaped. For years I told myself I was serving justice, but the truth is it was revenge, plain and simple. Oh, please, Eleanor whispered, understanding now some of the shadows she had glimpsed in him. I'm not proud of it, Preston continued. It didn't bring Sarah back, didn't ease the pain, just left me hollow inside. He turned to look at Eleanor directly. But I wanted you to know. Before we go any further in this marriage, you deserve to know who you're really married to. Eleanor considered his confession carefully. The man beside her had taken lives not in self-defense or the heat of battle, but in cold, calculated vengeance. And yet, he was also the man who had opened his home to a pregnant stranger, who had married her to protect her reputation, who held their son with such tenderness it brought tears to her eyes. Thank you for telling me, she said finally. It can't have been easy. Preston shook his head. You're not afraid, disgusted? No, Eleanor said truthfully. Sad, perhaps, for the young man you were, carrying such a burden of grief and rage, but not afraid, never that. Relief washed over Preston's face. Hesitantly, he reached for her hand and she gave it willingly. When you came into my life, Ellie, it was like a window opening in a dark room. You and Samuel, you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. A reason to look forward instead of back. The naked emotion in his voice touched Eleanor deeply. Without thinking, she leaned forward and kissed him, not the brief, almost ceremonial kisses they had shared before, but a real kiss, full of the feelings that had been growing between them. Preston responded with a hunger that surprised them both, pulling her close, his hands tangling in her hair. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Ellie, Preston said hoarsely, I don't expect that is, I know our arrangement. Eleanor silenced him with another brief kiss. I'm your wife, please, in every way that matters, if you want me, want you. Preston's laugh was soft and wondering. Ellie, I've wanted you since I saw you standing in that saloon doorway in your muddy wedding dress, looking like you might take on the whole town if you had to. Later, much later, as they lay together in what was now truly their shared bedroom, Eleanor traced the scars on Preston's chest, souvenirs of the bank robbery, the cattle drives, the hard life he had lived. No regrets? He asked again, echoing his question from their wedding night. Eleanor smiled in the darkness, feeling truly at peace for the first time in longer than she could remember. None at all. Spring came to Quartz Hill in a riot of wildflowers and new growth. Samuel grew quickly, a happy baby with his mother's auburn hair and his father's blue eyes. By his 4th month, he was rolling over, fascinated by the world around him, and developing a laugh that could melt the heart of anyone who heard it. Eleanor had taken to ranch life with a determination that impressed even Preston. She had learned to ride, becoming comfortable enough on horseback to accompany Preston on short trips around the property. True to his prediction, she had shown an aptitude for shooting, practicing diligently until she could hit a target consistently at 20 paces. Not bad for a city girl, Preston had teased after one particularly successful session. Just wait until Samuel's old enough for me to teach him, Eleanor had replied with a grin. Between the two of us, we'll keep you humble. Their marriage had deepened into a partnership that went beyond the practical arrangement they had initially agreed to. There was genuine affection between them now, and a physical passion that had surprised them both. Eleanor had discovered that beneath Preston's reserved exterior lay a capacity for tenderness and desire that matched her own. As promised, Preston never asked about the attack that had left her pregnant, never made her feel that Samuel was anything less than their son. In return, Eleanor respected the occasional dark moods that still overtook him, the nightmares that sometimes woke him in a cold sweat, calling Sarah's name. They were not perfect, either of them, but they were healing together, building something new from the broken pieces of their pasts. In April, they received a telegram from Sheriff Miller that brought both relief and closure. The stagecoach bandits had been captured in Tucson after attempting to rob a bank. All 3 men, including the one with the scarred hand, would stand trial for their crimes. Would you want to testify? Preston asked gently after sharing the news. They could convict him for what he did to you. Eleanor considered the question carefully, looking at Samuel, who was napping peacefully in his cradle. No, she said finally, that part of my life is over. I won't give him any more power over me or our son. Preston nodded, understanding in his eyes. Then we'll put it behind us, all of it. As summer approached again, marking a year since Eleanor had arrived in Quartz Hill, Preston suggested a trip into town for supplies and to show off how much Samuel had grown. The ranch was prospering under their joint management, with Preston focusing on expanding the herd while Eleanor had started a successful side business selling eggs and vegetables to the hotel in town. Quartz Hill itself had changed somewhat in the months since Eleanor had last visited. The railroad spur that had been under construction was now complete, bringing new businesses and travelers to the once sleepy town. As they drove the wagon down the main street, Samuel secure in Eleanor's arms, they noticed several new storefronts and a hotel being built on the corner. Town's growing, Preston observed. Might be good for business. Eleanor nodded, though she felt a twinge of apprehension about the changes. Part of her treasured the isolation of the ranch, the privacy it afforded their small family. They had just finished loading supplies at the general store when a familiar voice called out, stopping Eleanor in her tracks. Eleanor Sinclair, is that you? She turned slowly, her heart hammering in her chest, to find Thomas Wellington staring at her in disbelief. He was thinner than she remembered, his once immaculate suit slightly worn at the cuffs, but his expression of entitled superiority was unchanged. It's Eleanor Zachary now, Preston said, moving to stand beside his wife, his posture protective but not threatening. Thomas's eyes darted between them, then fixed on Samuel, who was watching the stranger with curious eyes. So you went through with it, he said, his tone dismissive. Keeping the bastard child. Preston's muscles tensed, but Eleanor laid a restraining hand on his arm. This is my son, Thomas. And this is my husband. I suggest you choose your next words very carefully. Thomas had the grace to look slightly abashed. I apologize, that was uncalled for. What are you doing in Quartz Hill? Eleanor asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Business, Thomas replied vaguely. The railroad has created opportunities for those who know where to look. Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. Thomas had always had a nose for profit, if not for loyalty or compassion. An awkward silence fell between them. Finally, Thomas cleared his throat. "You look well, Eleanor. Motherhood seems to agree with you." "Thank you," Eleanor replied coolly. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we should be getting home." As they turned to go, Thomas called after them, "I've often wondered if I made a mistake that day, if perhaps I was too hasty." Preston stopped, turning back to face the man who had abandoned Eleanor at her most vulnerable. His voice was calm but carried an undercurrent of steel when he spoke. "Mr. Wellington, I don't believe in regrets, generally speaking. But in this case, I'm mighty glad you made the mistake you did. Otherwise, this fine woman might not be my wife, and I wouldn't have the joy of calling this boy my son." He tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "So I reckon I owe you my thanks." With that, he guided Eleanor and Samuel to their wagon, helping them up before climbing in himself. As they drove away, Eleanor leaned against Preston's shoulder, feeling a strange mixture of closure and gratitude. "Are you all right?" Preston asked quietly. Eleanor nodded, looking down at Samuel, who was contentedly chewing on his fist. "More than all right. Seeing him just now, I felt nothing." "No anger, no regret, nothing at all." Preston smiled, understanding the significance of her words. "That's good." "I was thinking," Eleanor said after a while as the town receded behind them and the open country spread out before them, "maybe we could expand the house a bit, add another bedroom." Preston glanced at her. "Samuel's still small enough to stay in our room for a while yet." "It's not for Samuel," Eleanor said, a smile playing at her lips. "At least, not directly." Preston's brow furrowed in confusion, then his eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Ellie, are you saying, Doctor?" "Wilson confirmed it yesterday," Eleanor said, her smile broadening. "We're going to have another baby, please. Around Christmas, he thinks." The wagon came to an abrupt halt as Preston pulled on the reins, too stunned to continue driving. "Another baby," he repeated, wonder in his voice. "A brother or sister for Samuel." "Are you pleased?" Eleanor asked, suddenly uncertain at his reaction. In answer, Preston gathered her and Samuel into his arms, mindful of the baby between them. "Please doesn't begin to cover it, Ellie. I'm—" He shook his head, seemingly at a loss for words, then simply kissed her, pouring all his joy and love into the gesture. When they broke apart, both a little breathless, Samuel was gurgling happily, patting at their faces with his small hands as if joining in the celebration. "We should get home," Preston said finally, picking up the reins again. "Got plans to make." As they continued their journey back to the ranch, Eleanor reflected on the strange, winding path that had brought her here. A year ago, she had stood abandoned at the altar, her future in ruins, carrying a child conceived in violence. Now she was riding beside a man who loved her, with one healthy son in her arms and another child growing beneath her heart. Life was unpredictable, often painful, sometimes cruel. But it could also be unexpectedly generous, offering second chances and new beginnings when you least expected them. As the ranch came into view, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude for the twist of fate that had brought her to Quartz Hill, and to Preston Zachary, the cowboy who had offered to be a father to her child and had become so much more than that. "Home," Preston said, a simple word that contained worlds of meaning. Eleanor squeezed his hand. "Yes," she agreed. "Home." Christmas arrived with a light dusting of snow, transforming the ranch into a winter wonderland that delighted 16-month-old Samuel. Eleanor, now heavily pregnant with their second child, watched from the window as Preston built a small snowman with their son, whose squeals of delight carried clearly through the crisp air. The past year had brought many changes to their lives. Preston had added 2 rooms to the house, a larger bedroom for Samuel and a nursery for the new baby. Eleanor's vegetable business had expanded to include preserves and baked goods, which were now sold at the general store in Quartz Hill. The ranch itself had prospered, with Preston taking on 2 hands to help manage the growing herd. But the most significant changes had been less tangible. The partnership that had begun as a practical arrangement had blossomed into deep love. Preston, once so guarded with his emotions, now expressed his affection freely, both in words and actions. Eleanor had found a confidence she hadn't known she possessed, becoming not just a wife and mother but a true partner in all their enterprises. As evening approached, Preston brought Samuel inside, the boy's cheeks rosy from cold and excitement. "Look at you two," Eleanor laughed as Samuel toddled toward her, arms outstretched, like a pair of snow angels. "He's a natural cowboy," Preston declared proudly, hanging up their coats. "Threw his first snowball today." "At you, I presume?" Eleanor asked, settling Samuel on her lap or what remained of it with her expanded belly. "Got me right in the face," Preston confirmed with a grin. "Boy's got an arm on him." After supper, as they sat by the fire with Samuel playing at their feet, Preston produced a small package from his pocket. "Early Christmas present," he said, handing it to Eleanor. "Figured with the baby coming any day, we might not get a chance later." Eleanor unwrapped the package carefully to find a delicate silver locket. Opening it, she found a tiny photograph of Preston on one side and Samuel on the other. "It's beautiful," she said, tears springing to her eyes. "Will you put it on me?" Preston fastened the chain around her neck, his fingers gentle against her skin. "Room for one more picture when the new little one arrives," he said. Eleanor touched the locket, deeply moved by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "I have something for you too," she said, "though it's not wrapped." She reached for her sewing basket and pulled out a folded document. "I've been working with Mr. Daniels, the lawyer in town," she explained, handing it to Preston. "This makes it official. Samuel is your son in every legal sense. Your name is on his birth certificate now." Preston stared at the adoption papers, his expression stunned. "How did you manage this?" "Mr. Daniels has connections in the territorial government," Eleanor explained. "It took some doing, but he convinced a judge to make an exception in our case. Samuel Preston Zachary is now your son in the eyes of the law, not just in our hearts." Preston's eyes glistened with emotion as he looked from the document to Samuel, who was contentedly stacking wooden blocks by the fire. "This is the best gift anyone has ever given me," he said hoarsely. "Thank you, Ellie." Before Eleanor could reply, a sharp pain gripped her abdomen, making her gasp. Preston was immediately at her side, his face concerned. "The baby?" he asked. Eleanor nodded, breathing through the contraction. "I think your Christmas present is about to arrive a day early." Unlike Samuel's birth, which had been a frantic, storm-bound affair, their second child entered the world with relative ease. Dr. Wilson arrived promptly. Mrs. Johnson from the neighboring ranch came to care for Samuel, and by midnight, Eleanor was cradling their newborn daughter in her arms. "She's perfect," Preston whispered, sitting on the edge of the bed, his expression one of awe as he counted the baby's tiny fingers. "Looks just like her mother." Eleanor smiled tiredly. "Poor child. Let's hope she gets your temperament to balance it out." "Heaven help us if she gets your stubbornness and my temper," Preston laughed softly. The baby yawned, her rosebud mouth forming a perfect O before she settled back to sleep against Eleanor's breast. "What shall we name her?" Eleanor asked. Preston considered for a moment. "What about Hope?" "Seems fitting, considering everything." "Hope," Eleanor repeated, testing the name. "Hope Sarah Zachary." Preston looked up sharply. "Sarah," Eleanor nodded. If you don't mind, I thought she was important to you, and in a way she's part of our story too." Preston's eyes filled with tears that he made no attempt to hide. "I think she would have liked that," he said simply. "Thank you." On Christmas morning, they introduced Samuel to his baby sister. The little boy approached the cradle cautiously, his expression serious as he peered at the swaddled infant. "Baby?" he asked, looking to Preston for confirmation. "That's right, son. This is Hope, your sister." Samuel considered this information gravely, then reached out a tentative finger to touch the baby's cheek. "My Hope," he declared, then looked up with a smile that melted his parents' hearts. "My baby." As snow fell gently outside the window, and the small family gathered around the cradle, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 2 years ago, she could never have imagined this life, this happiness. From the darkest moment of her life had come unexpected joy. A family built not on conventional beginnings but on choice, commitment, and love. Preston's arm encircled her waist as they watched their children, one born of violence but raised in love, the other a physical embodiment of the bond between them. "Happy?" he asked softly. Eleanor leaned against him, feeling the solid strength that had been her anchor through so much. "More than I ever thought possible." Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, casting golden light across the snow-covered ranch, their home, their future, their second chance at happiness. And in that moment, Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that sometimes the most beautiful beginnings could arise from the most painful endings. That sometimes, when a woman was abandoned at the altar and a cowboy offered to be father to her child, what started as an act of kindness could grow into the greatest love story ever told, their love story.